please don't do this. My family had nothing to do with it. You have to believe me.
The morning mist still clung to the iron gates of the Ferretti estate when the silence was shattered. It wasn't the sound of gunfire, but something much more dangerous to a man like Lorenzo Ferretti, a mother's scream. Talia Brooks, her maid's apron stained with the dust of the driveway, didn't care about the 3 submachine guns pointed at her chest. She didn't care about the unspoken rule that she was to be invisible, a shadow that polished silver and folded linens. She lunged toward the matte black SUV, her fingers, calloused from years of labor, clutching at the cold, reinforced steel of the door. "They're taking my child," she shrieked, her voice breaking against the bulletproof glass. Inside, the world was silent, smelling of expensive leather and old money. The man in the backseat, Lorenzo Ferretti, didn't move. He was a king of a world built on shallow graves and blood debts, a man whose neck tattoos were a map of every sin he'd committed to keep his throne. His security team waited for the signal to remove her, permanently. But as the window lowered, the atmosphere changed. The untouchable Dawn didn't look at her with anger, but with a terrifying, calculated stillness. Talia wasn't just a maid anymore. She was the spark that was about to set his entire criminal empire on fire. The memory of it still clawed at Talia's lungs, more suffocating than the dust of the driveway she now knelt upon. It had happened in the gray, liminal space of 5:00 a.m., just as she was preparing to leave her small apartment for the Ferretti estate. The front door hadn't just opened. It had ceased to exist, splintered inward by the weight of 3 men who moved with the practiced, chilling efficiency of shadows. She remembered the cold bite of the morning air, the way her coffee cup had shattered on the linoleum, and the high, thin wail of her 3-year-old Marcus as he was ripped from his bed. She had fought, God, how she had fought, but a heavy hand had pinned her to the floor, the metallic scent of a pistol pressed against her temple, silencing her screams. "Tell the Dawn we've collected the first installment," a voice had hissed, low and vibrating with a cruel amusement. And then they were gone. The true horror, however, hadn't been the abduction. It was the silence that followed. Talia had run to the 4th precinct, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart a drumbeat of pure terror. She had stood before the high wooden desk of Sergeant Miller, her words tripping over each other as she described the black van and the tattoos on the men's knuckles. But the sergeant hadn't reached for his radio. He hadn't even reached for a pen. He had looked at her, really looked at her, and Talia felt the temperature in the room drop. He saw the faded fabric of her coat, the frantic desperation of a woman from the wrong side of the tracks, and the address on her ID that marked her as a nobody. "Look, Ms. Brooks," Miller had said, his voice dripping with a patronizing exhaustion. "People in your neighborhood, children wander off, or maybe the father decided it was his turn for custody. We don't trigger Amber Alerts for domestic disputes." It wasn't a dispute. They had guns. They mentioned Lorenzo Ferretti. Talia had screamed, her hands slamming against the desk. The entire precinct had gone still at the mention of the name. Miller's eyes didn't fill with resolve. They filled with a sharp, defensive flick of fear. He leaned forward, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights like a warning. "You want to bring the Ferretti name into a police station? You want to cause that kind of trouble?" He leaned back, dismissively waving a hand toward the door. "Go home. Wait for a call. Don't waste our time with ghost stories because you're behind on your rent." It was then, standing under the buzzing lights of the station, that Talia realized the law wasn't a shield. It was a wall. To them, she was invisible. To them, Marcus was just another statistic in a neighborhood they had already given up on. If she wanted a monster to hunt the men who took her son, she couldn't go to the men in blue. She had to go to the devil himself. The iron gates of the Ferretti estate usually acted as a silent boundary between 2 worlds, but to Talia, they were now the only gates to heaven or hell. She didn't approach them with the quiet, bowed head of a servant arriving for a shift. She came with the velocity of a woman who had already died inside. The security cameras swiveled, their red eyes tracking her frantic movements as she bypassed the pedestrian entrance and sprinted toward the main driveway, where the heavy columns of stone met the reinforced steel. "Stop right there," a voice boomed, amplified by a loudspeaker that made the very air vibrate. Talia didn't stop. She saw the flash of sunlight on the barrels of the guards' rifles as they stepped out from the stone guardhouse. These were not the lazy, bored officers of the 4th Precinct. These were Lorenzo's wolves, trained to neutralize threats before they reached the front door. They moved with a lethal, synchronized grace, forming a human wall between her and the sprawling mansion. "Back away, Talia, you know the rules," shouted Marco, the head of the gate detail. He knew her. He had seen her every morning for 3 years, but as he leveled his weapon, his face was a mask of cold professionalism. "One more step and we are authorized to use force. Go back to the servants' quarters." "Shoot me then." Talia's voice was a raw, jagged edge that cut through the morning stillness. She didn't slow down, her shoes skidding on the loose gravel as she lunged toward the inner perimeter. "If you don't let me talk to him, you might as well pull the trigger because I'm not leaving without my son." The click of safeties being disengaged sounded like thunder in the sudden silence. Marco's finger tightened on the trigger, his eyes narrow, calculating the distance. He saw the madness in her eyes, the kind of pure, unadulterated grief that made a person bulletproof. She was 20 feet away, then 15. The guards braced themselves, a fraction of a second away from ending her life to protect the Dawn's peace. But then, the heavy thrum of a high-performance engine echoed from the garage. The black motorcade was beginning its morning departure. Talia saw the lead car, the armored beast that carried the man who held the city in his fist. With a final, desperate burst of strength, she threw herself past the startled guard at the front, her body a blur of gray fabric and flying hair. She didn't aim for the house. She aimed for the path of the moving car. She collapsed onto the pavement directly in the trajectory of the heavy tires, her arms outstretched, her forehead pressed against the hot asphalt. She was a living roadblock, a fragile piece of humanity standing in the way of an empire, waiting for either the crush of the wheels or the mercy of the man inside. The heavy door of the lead SUV didn't just open. It unlatched with a slow, mechanical finality that seemed to suck the air out of the driveway. Lorenzo Ferretti stepped out into the humid morning air, his presence a physical weight, a cold front moving across the gravel. He didn't look at his guards, who stood like statues of salt, their rifles still half-raised in a state of paralyzed confusion. He looked only at the woman crumpled near his front tire, the woman who had just turned his fortress into a theater of desperation. Talia didn't look up. She couldn't. The adrenaline that had fueled her sprint past the gates had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, soul-crushing terror. She waited for the sound of a pistol being cocked or the harsh command to drag her away. Instead, she heard the rhythmic, expensive click of Italian leather soles approaching her on the pavement. Lorenzo stopped a mere foot away. To the world, he was a ghost, a myth of power and whispered violence. To Talia, in this moment, he was simply the only person left on earth with the strength to move mountains. "You are Talia," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried the chill of a deep-sea current. "You have polished my floors for 3 years. You have been a shadow in the hallways. Why have you stepped into the light today to commit suicide?" Talia pushed herself up, her palms raw and bleeding from the grit of the driveway. She forced herself to look at him, meeting a gaze so sharp it felt like it could dissect her thoughts. "Because the police told me my son doesn't exist," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry earth. "They told me Marcus is a ghost story, but the men who took him, they told me they were collecting for you." The air around Lorenzo seemed to drop 10 degrees. The calculated boredom in his eyes vanished, replaced by a terrifying, predatory stillness. He didn't signal his men to remove her. Instead, in a move that caused a ripple of visible shock to pass through his security detail, the Don slowly lowered himself. He knelt on one knee in the dirt, his $1,000 trousers pressing into the same gravel that had shredded Talia's skin. He leaned in until he was inches from her face, the tattoos on his neck, dark, intricate secrets of a life lived in blood, visible just above his silk collar. He wasn't a boss looking at an employee. He was a king looking at a subject who had just brought him news of treason. "They used my name," he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more dangerous than any shout. "Tell me every word they said, Talia. Tell me the color of their eyes and the smell of their skin, because if you are lying to save yourself, I will let the world forget you. But if someone is using my shadow to hide their filth, if they touched a child under my protection. Then they have invited a monster into their homes, and I am that monster." He didn't wait for her to answer. He reached out, his large, scarred hand closing firmly around her forearm, not to restrain her, but to pull her up from the dirt. Lorenzo didn't signal for the lead car to move, nor did he return to the safety of his armored SUV. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a key fob, the silver prancing horse glinting in the morning light. "Marco," he called out, his voice cutting through the stunned silence of the driveway. "The keys to the 812, and stay here." The head of security took a step forward, his face pale. "Sir, protocol dictates a 3-car minimum. We haven't swept the perimeter of the precinct's route. You can't go out there alone, especially not with—" He gestured vaguely at Talia, who was still trembling, her eyes wide as she tried to process the shift in the world's axis. "I didn't ask for a risk assessment, Marco. I gave an order." Lorenzo's voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a death sentence. "If I cannot drive through my own city without a phalanx of soldiers, then I have already lost it. Stay at the gates. If I'm not back in 2 hours, start burning the phone lines." The guard stood paralyzed as the Don walked toward the side garage, his stride purposeful and predatory. He emerged moments later in a blood-red Ferrari, the engines roar a primal scream that echoed off the limestone walls of the estate. He skidded to a halt beside Talia and leaned across the passenger seat to throw the door open. "Get in," he commanded. Talia hesitated, her hand hovering over the pristine leather. She was a woman who spent her days scrubbing the underside of his dining table, and now she was being invited into the inner sanctum of his power. "Mr. Ferretti, your men—" "They're right. It's not safe." Lorenzo looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the cold flint in his eyes softened into something resembling respect. "They took your child from your home, Talia. Safety is a lie we tell the weak so they don't revolt. Today, we stop lying." She slid into the seat, the car's interior smelling of expensive cedar and a cold, metallic tang that she realized was the scent of the suppressed handgun tucked into the door pocket. As the gates groaned open, Lorenzo didn't wait for a clear path. He floored the accelerator, the tires screaming as they tore out of the estate. Behind them, the most sophisticated security team in the state watched their boss disappear into the morning traffic without a single guard. It was a massive breach of protocol, a tactical nightmare that left Lorenzo vulnerable to every rival family in the city. But as the speedometer climbed, Talia realized he wasn't driving like a man afraid of an ambush. He was driving like the storm itself, heading toward the one place the police had told her was a dead end. He wasn't just taking her back to her apartment. He was taking her to the scene of the crime to begin a harvest of his own. The Ferrari tore through the city like a jagged blade, the engines roared, drowning out the frantic thrum of Talia's heart. Lorenz didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the road, but his hand moved with the precision of a surgeon toward the dashboard's integrated console. He didn't dial a number. He pressed a sequence of hidden keys that bypassed the digital grid, opening a line that didn't exist on any map. "The clock is ticking," Lorenzo said into the air, his voice devoid of emotion. "A child was taken from the Brooks residence at 5:00 a.m. A black van, 3 men. They used my name to seal the door. Find them." A distorted, gravelly voice crackled back through the speakers, one of the many shadows Lorenzo kept on a tether in the city's underbelly. "Don Ferretti, we're seeing chatter, but it's not coming from the usual circles. It's coming from the docks. The Southside Export Group." Talia watched the muscles in Lorenzo's jaw tighten. The Southside Export Group wasn't a rival gang. They were the logistics arm of his own shipping empire. They were the men who managed his warehouses, the men he broke bread with every Christmas. His own business associates were using his name not just as a threat, but as a shield to hide a side business in human inventory. "They think they can use my shadow to hide their filth," Lorenzo whispered, more to himself than to her. He tapped the screen again, pulling up a series of encrypted manifests. His eyes scanned the scrolling data with terrifying speed, identifying the gaps in the records, the phantom shipments that moved when the legitimate workers were at home. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The debt collection ring wasn't an outside entity. It was a cancer growing within his own ribs. His associates had become greedy, branching out into the one trade Lorenzo had forbidden under penalty of death. They had targeted Talia because they thought she was a ghost, a woman with no voice, no power, and no one to listen to her screams. They assumed the Don would never notice a missing child in the margins of his ledger. There at Warehouse 14, the voice returned, sounding hesitant now. But Lorenzo, Captain Miller's squad car is parked outside. It's a joint venture. The Ferrari's tires screamed as Lorenzo pulled a violent U-turn, weaving through morning traffic with a lethal disregard for the law. Talia gripped the door handle, her knuckles white. She saw the change in him. The king of the city was gone, replaced by something ancient and hungry. "They have my child," she asked, her voice trembling. "They have something of mine," Lorenzo replied, his voice a low, vibrating growl as he floored the accelerator toward the docks. "They have my honor, and they are about to learn that when I settle a debt, I don't leave anything behind but ashes." The warehouse at the edge of the docks was a cavern of rusted corrugated metal and salt-thickened air. As the Ferrari skidded to a halt, the silhouette of a police cruiser was already there, its lights dark, but its presence a clear signal of the betrayal. Lorenz didn't hesitate. He stepped out of the car, his movements fluid and eerily calm, ignoring the three men who emerged from the shadows of the loading bay. They weren't strangers. They were his own lieutenants, men who had sat at his table, now standing alongside Captain Miller of the 4th Precinct. "Don Lorenzo," Miller said, stepping into the dim light with a hand resting casually on his holster. "You're a long way from the estate without your leash. This is a private matter. Walk away, and we can forget you ever saw this." Lorenzo didn't stop until he was 10 feet away, standing in the center of a kill zone. He could see the movement in the rafters, snipers from the rival Southside gang, their red laser sights dancing across his chest like blood-red insects. It was a perfect trap, a convergence of corrupt law and greedy associates designed to end his reign. Talia watched from the car, her breath fogging the glass, her eyes searching the dark corners for any sign of a small child. "You speak of private matters, Miller, while you hide behind my name," Lorenzo said, his voice carrying through the hollow space with the weight of falling stone. The men around him shifted, their confidence wavering at the sheer lack of fear in his eyes. "You think these walls and these guns make you safe. You think because I came alone, I am vulnerable." "You are alone, Lorenzo," one of the lieutenants spat, raising his weapon. "The South Side has the docks now. You're just a relic in a nice suit." Lorenzo didn't reach for a gun. Instead, he pulled a single burner phone from his pocket and pressed a button. He held it up, the screen glowing in the darkness. "I am never alone in this city. I am the city." Through the speaker, a voice began to read out a list of names. The names of the wives, children, and secret bank accounts of every man standing in that room. It was the shadow registry, the insurance policy Lorenzo had spent 20 years building. One by one, the cell phones in the pockets of the kidnappers began to vibrate. The silence that followed was absolute. The snipers in the rafters froze. The lieutenant's hand began to shake. They realized that while they had been planning a murder, Lorenzo had been preparing an extinction. With a single phone call, he had neutralized their leverage and turned their own greed into a noose. "The child," Lorenzo whispered, his gaze fixed on Captain Miller. "Bring him to me now, or I will let the world see what happens when the shadow of the Ferretti family is cast over yours." The trap didn't spring. It disintegrated. Fear, cold and paralyzing, took hold of the room as the men who thought they were kings realized they were merely prey. The tension in the warehouse didn't just break. It curdled into a thick, suffocating dread. Captain Miller and the turncoat lieutenant stood paralyzed, their weapons sagging as the realization of Lorenzo's reach sank in. Lorenz didn't look at them with the heat of a man in a fight. He looked at them with the glacial detachment of a judge passing a final sentence. He reached back and rapped his knuckles twice against the Ferrari's passenger window. "Talia," he called, his voice projecting into every dark corner of the rafters. "Come out." The door opened, and Talia stepped onto the oil-stained concrete. She looked small against the backdrop of the towering crates and the armed men, her simple work clothes a stark contrast to the violence surrounding her. But as she walked to Lorenzo's side, he didn't move her behind him. Instead, he placed a heavy, tattooed hand on her shoulder and pivoted her to face the men who had dismissed her as a ghost story only hours before. "Look at her," Lorenzo commanded, his eyes locking onto Captain Miller's. "You saw a woman who was invisible. You saw a maid with no name, no standing, and no power. You thought her grief was a nuisance you could sweep under a rug." He stepped forward, pulling Talia with him, forcing the line of traitors to retreat a step. The light from the high, grime-streaked windows caught the silver in his hair and the cold iron in his gaze. "But you forgot who polishes the silver in my house. You forgot whose hands prepare the food that sustains my table. In my world, loyalty is the only currency that matters, and this woman has given me 3 years of it." Lorenzo's voice dropped to a terrifying, resonant whisper that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. "She is not just a maid. She is of the House of Ferretti, and you made the fatal mistake of thinking that my protection ended at the gates of my estate. Let it be known from the docks to the high-rises, an attack on her is an attack on my throne. A hand laid on her child is a hand laid on my heart, and I am a man who can live without a heart, but I will never live without my honor." He looked up at the shadows in the rafters, where the rival gang's snipers were still hiding. "Tell your bosses what you saw today. Tell them that Lorenzo Ferretti kneels for no one, but he stands for his own. If that child is not in his mother's arms in 60 seconds, I will turn this city into a graveyard, and I will start with every man in this room." For a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic dripping of water from a leaky pipe. Then, the heavy door of a back office groaned open. A trembling guard emerged, clutching a small, wide-eyed boy. Talia let out a sound that was half sob, half scream, breaking from Lorenzo's side to fly across the concrete. As she gathered Marcus into her arms, the king of the city stood motionless, a silent, predatory sentinel ensuring that for the first time in her life, the world finally saw her. The moment Talia's fingers brushed her son's jacket, the warehouse erupted. Lorenzo hadn't waited for the kidnappers to find their courage. He had timed the rescue to the heartbeat. The corrugated roof didn't just rattle, it shattered as 4 black-clad figures descended on high-speed lines, flashbangs detonating with a blinding, bone-shaking roar. In the whiteout chaos, Lorenzo's tactical team moved like ghosts in the smoke, their silenced weapons coughing in rhythmic pairs. They weren't there to negotiate, they were there to clear the path. While his men neutralized the snipers in the rafters with surgical precision, Lorenzo didn't dive for cover. He moved through the smoke with a terrifying, predatory calm toward Captain Miller. The corrupt officer had reached for his service weapon, but before he could level the barrel, Lorenzo's hand closed around his throat. The don't strength was deceptive, fueled by a cold, righteous fury that had been simmering since the first scream on his driveway. He slammed Miller against a rusted shipping container, the metal groaning under the impact. "You took a bribe to look the other way while a child cried," Lorenzo hissed, his face inches from the captain. The tattoos on Lorenzo's neck seemed to writhe in the flickering light of the strobing sirens outside. "You wore that badge like a shield, but today it's just a target." Miller gasped, his face turning a bruised purple, his heels kicking uselessly against the steel. "Lorenzo, please, it was just business." "In my house, family is the only business," Lorenzo replied. He didn't use a gun. He used the very handcuffs Miller had used to intimidate the innocent, ratcheting them tight around the captain's wrists and hooking them to the high-tension crane hook dangling nearby. With a cold flick of a lever, the winch groaned, hoisting the screaming man 5 feet into the air, leaving him dangling as a warning to every corrupt soul in the city. Across the floor, the lead kidnapper, the man who had pinned Talia to her linoleum floor, tried to bolt for the back exit. He didn't make it 5 steps. Lorenzo intercepted him with a brutal short-arc strike that shattered the man's jaw. As the kidnapper collapsed, Lorenzo stood over him, looking down not with anger but with a chilling lack of it. He reached into the man's pocket, retrieved the small, silver locket they had torn from Talia's neck during the abduction, and tucked it into his own vest. "You told her to tell me you were collecting an installment," Lorenzo whispered, kneeling beside the broken man. "Consider this the final payment." By the time the smoke cleared, The warehouse was a tomb of silence, broken only by Talia's ragged sobs as she clutched Marcus to her chest in the backseat of the Ferrari. Lorenzo's tactical lead approached, nodding once to confirm the perimeter was secure. The Don straightened his cuffs, wiped a single drop of blood from his cheek with a silk handkerchief, and turned his back on the wreckage. He had just started a war with the city's elite, but as he looked at the mother and child safe in his car, the king of the city knew he had finally won something far more valuable than territory. The return to the Ferretti estate was not a quiet retreat, but a procession that signaled the death of the old world. As the blood-red Ferrari glided through the iron gates, the security team, men who had seen the worst of humanity, stood at a rigid, respectful attention. Lorenz didn't pull around to the servants' entrance. He stopped the car directly at the base of the grand marble staircase, the very spot where Talia's knees had scraped the gravel only hours before. Talia emerged from the car, clutching Marcus so tightly that the boy's small hands were lost in the folds of her worn coat. She looked at the towering oak doors of the main house, her eyes filling with a new kind of fear, the fear of a boundary she had never been permitted to cross. But Lorenzo was already there, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back, guiding her forward with a quiet, undeniable gravity. "Mr. Ferretti," she whispered, her voice trembling as they reached the threshold. "My quarters are at the back, I should go." "The back is for employees, Talia," Lorenzo interrupted, his voice echoing in the vast, vaulted foyer. He looked up at the crystal chandeliers and the priceless art, things he had once valued as the markers of his success. "Today, you and Marcus move into the East Wing. There will be no more polishing floors. There will be no more shadows." The estate staff gathered in the hallways, watching in stunned silence as the Don himself carried the child's small, battered backpack into the heart of the home. Lorenz looked at his reflection in a gilded mirror, the tattoos on his neck, the scars on his hands, the coldness that had defined him for decades. For years, he had believed his empire was built on fear, a fortress designed to keep the world out. He had viewed people like Talia as the invisible gears that kept his life running, as replaceable as the silver she cleaned. But as he watched Marcus reach out a small hand to touch a marble banister and saw the color finally returning to Talia's face, the weight of his empire shifted. He realized that a throne built only on blood was a tomb. The power he wielded was meaningless if it couldn't protect a single child from the wolves he had allowed into his own circle. The war that was coming, the legal battles, the retaliations from the South Side, the fallout of hanging a police captain, didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a cleansing fire. Lorenzo turned to his head of security, Marco, who stood waiting for orders. "From today, the rules of this house have changed," the Don declared. "We are no longer just a business. We are a sanctuary. Anyone who targets the vulnerable in this city targets me personally. Ensure the East Wing is fully staffed for our guests. They stay here under my roof until the day I am no longer breathing." As Talia finally let out a long, shuddering breath of safety, Lorenzo felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth in his chest. He had spent his life building a kingdom of shadows, but in choosing the maid's child over his own cold logic, he had finally found his soul. The king of the city was gone. In his place stood a guardian, ready to burn the world down to keep the innocent warm. Lorenzo Ferretti started that day as a man feared for his darkness, but he ended it as the only light a desperate mother had left. He proved that sometimes, the most dangerous man in the room is the only one who can truly provide justice when the world turns its back. Talia didn't just find her son that day. She found a protector who would shatter his own empire before he let another innocent soul go unheard. But this is only the beginning of the war Lorenzo has started. To protect the weak, he has challenged the powerful, and the city will never be the same again. What would you have done if you were in Lorenzo's shoes? Would you have risked your entire legacy for a stranger or stayed behind your golden gates? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one of your thoughts. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps us tell more stories of unlikely heroes. And if you haven't yet, click subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a moment of justice. Thank you for watching. Remember, sometimes courage is found in the places you least expect.